October, 48 BC. Alexandria, Egypt. In the great royal palace overlooking the harbor, Julius Caesar sat surrounded by trouble. He had just turned 52. He had won a civil war, chased a rival to the edge of the world, and watched that rival's severed head presented to him on a beach like a grotesque gift. Now he was stranded, 4,000 soldiers against a city of 500,000, waiting for a quarrel between Egyptian siblings to resolve itself. He did not expect what came through the door that night. A merchant had docked at the harbor, carrying what appeared to be a rolled bundle of linen. His name was Apollodorus the Sicilian. He was, in fact, carrying a queen. Cleopatra VII had been driven from her own kingdom 6 months earlier by her younger brother, Ptolemy XIII, and the 3 powerful advisors who controlled him. Her brother's army blocked every road back to Alexandria. The palace she had grown up in, the throne that was hers by right, the kingdom her family had ruled for 250 years, all of it stood on the other side of an army waiting to kill her. And so she rolled herself into a piece of cloth and had herself smuggled past. Plutarch, writing a century and a half later, described what happened next with barely concealed wonder. Something changed in that room. The Roman general who had seen everything looked at this 21-year-old woman, disheveled from her crossing, burning with intelligence and fury and need, and decided to throw his legions behind her cause. What she carried into that room was not beauty. It was something far more dangerous. A mind that had spent its entire life preparing for exactly this moment. A mind that understood, with perfect clarity, that a queen without a throne has exactly one asset left: herself. And that she had perhaps one evening to spend it well. This is the story of Cleopatra VII, the last of the Ptolemies, the last pharaoh of Egypt, the woman who nearly held back Rome. To understand what Cleopatra was fighting for, you have to understand what Alexandria was. When Alexander the Great conquered Egypt in 332 BC, he founded a city at the mouth of the Nile that would become the beating heart of the ancient world. After Alexander's death, his general, Ptolemy I Soter, seized Egypt and built a dynasty that would last nearly 3 centuries. At the center of that dynasty stood Alexandria, a city of 750,000 souls, where the world's first known lighthouse rose 300 feet into the Mediterranean sky, and where the great library gathered the sum total of human knowledge onto its shelves. The library held 500,000 scrolls. Scholars from every corner of the known world studied beneath its roof. Euclid derived the principles of geometry in its halls. Eratosthenes used a stick and the angle of sunlight to calculate the circumference of the entire Earth, to within 200 miles. Herophilus dissected human bodies and mapped the nervous system. This was Alexandria, a city so extraordinary that even Rome, vast and conquering, looked at it and felt something like envy. Into this world, Cleopatra VII was born around 69 BC, second child of Ptolemy XII Auletes, a king better known for his flute playing than for his statecraft. Her father's reign was defined by a single humiliating fact: Egypt was effectively Rome's client. Ptolemy had spent 2 years in Rome bribing senators for recognition, borrowing enormous sums from Roman bankers. By the time Cleopatra was a child, Egypt owed Rome 17.5 million drachmas. The richest kingdom in the world was, in practical terms, Rome's debtor. The royal court she grew up in was not a comfortable place. The Ptolemaic family had a tradition of fratricidal violence that made Shakespeare's tragedies look restrained. Siblings poisoned brothers, Mothers killed sons. 3 of Cleopatra's siblings would die by violence during her lifetime. This court taught her one lesson above all others. Power is never given. It must be seized, defended, and never for a moment left unwatched. What set her apart from every Ptolemaic ruler before her was education. The Ptolemies had ruled Egypt for over 200 years without bothering to learn Egyptian. They were a Greek dynasty, floating on top of an ancient civilization they never truly tried to understand, governing through intermediaries, treating the people below them as subjects of a conquered land, rather than inheritors of a living tradition. Cleopatra was the first to break this pattern. She learned Egyptian, and beyond it, Aramaic, Hebrew, Arabic, the languages of Parthia and Ethiopia. Ancient sources credit her with 9 languages in total. She understood that to rule Egypt, you had to become Egypt. She studied at the Mauseon, the institution that had nurtured the library's scholars, under the leading minds of the age. She styled herself in public as the goddess Isis incarnate, a living bridge between the ancient pharaonic tradition and the Hellenistic world. In the temples of Upper Egypt, her image was carved in the traditional style: hawk-headed gods and hieroglyphic cartouches. In the cosmopolitan courts of Alexandria, she debated philosophy in Greek. All of it, the languages, the learning, the theology, was strategy. Cleopatra understood something most rulers of her era did not. Legitimacy is a story, and the ruler who best tells the story of their own power is the ruler who keeps it. In 51 BC, Ptolemy XII died and left Egypt to his daughter and her 10-year-old brother, Ptolemy XIII, expected to reign together as co-rulers. Cleopatra, 18 years old, moved quickly to assert sole authority. She removed her brother's name from official documents and issued coins bearing her face alone. She might have succeeded had her brother's 3 advisors not decided to stop her. The eunuch Pothinus, the general Achilles, and the rhetorician Theodotus understood that a capable queen governing alone was a threat to their own power. By the spring of 48 BC, they had forced her to flee. She crossed to Syria, assembled an army, and camped in the desert near Pelusium, the eastern gateway to Egypt, staring at the horizon across which her kingdom lay. Then the wider world intervened. In August of 48 BC, Julius Caesar destroyed the army of his rival Pompey at the Battle of Pharsalus in Greece, effectively ending a Roman civil war. Pompey fled east, seeking refuge in Egypt. Ptolemy's advisors faced a brutal choice: protect Rome's losing general and make an enemy of the winner, or remove him before he became a liability. They chose the latter. Pompey was lured ashore and stabbed on a shallow Egyptian beach as he stepped from his boat. His head was pickled and presented to Caesar when the Roman arrived days later. Caesar, the ancient sources tell us, wept. Whether from genuine grief or from the loss of his chance to display Roman clemency, we cannot know. But he had inherited a situation far more complicated than expected, and into that situation, Cleopatra now moved. She had herself rolled in a piece of linen bedding and carried past her brother's guards to Caesar's quarters under cover of night. When she emerged, she was composed, persuasive, and completely certain of what she wanted. She spoke to Caesar not as a refugee, but as a queen, reclaiming what was hers. Caesar was captivated. He summoned Ptolemy XIII to the palace and announced his intention to arbitrate the siblings' dispute. The boy king's advisors refused. Pothinus sent orders to march the Egyptian army on Alexandria, 20,000 troops against Caesar's 4,000. For 5 months, Caesar and Cleopatra were besieged in the palace complex. The fighting reached the harbor, where Caesar set fire to ships threatening his fleet, and the blaze spread to the docks, possibly destroying warehouse collections associated with the Great Library. That repository of human knowledge Cleopatra had studied in as a girl now smoldered at the edges of a war fought partly on her behalf. In early 47 BC, reinforcements arrived overland from the east. The Egyptian forces were driven to the Nile. Ptolemy XIII, attempting to flee by boat, fell into the river and drowned. Cleopatra was 22 years old, and she had won. Caesar would stay in Egypt for months more, a period that produced a son whom she named Caesarion, the Little Caesar. When he finally departed for Rome in the spring of 47 BC, he left behind a restored queen, a newborn heir who carried the blood of Rome's greatest general, and an alliance that would define the next decade of Mediterranean history. The assassination of Julius Caesar on the Ides of March 44 BC sent shockwaves across the Mediterranean, and nowhere more than Alexandria, where Cleopatra had been living as Caesar's honored guest. Caesarion, her son, was barely 3 years old. The man who had restored her throne was dead, stabbed 23 times on the floor of the Roman Senate. She returned to Egypt with her son and her calculations. For 3 years, she watched as Rome devoured itself. Caesar's assassins, Brutus and Cassius, faced Caesar's successors, Octavian and Mark Antony, at the Battle of Philippi in 42 BC. Brutus and Cassius were defeated and killed. The Roman world divided, Octavian in the west, Antony in the east. Antony controlled the east, which meant he controlled Rome's relationship with Egypt. He summoned Cleopatra to Tarsus in 41 BC, ostensibly to answer charges she had supported his enemies. She could have come humbly. Instead, she came as a goddess. Plutarch describes the scene with visible relish. Cleopatra sailed up the river Cydnus in a gilded barge, its purple sails catching the wind, silver oars beating time to flute and harp music. She reclined beneath a canopy of cloth of gold, dressed as Aphrodite, fanned by boys costumed as cupids, attended by women dressed as sea nymphs, while sweet-smelling incense drifted across the water. The populace of Tarsus ran to the riverbank to watch. When Antony sent an invitation for her to dine, she replied that he should come to her. He came. Antony was a different man from Caesar, larger, louder, more given to passion and spectacle. Where Caesar had been cool calculation, Antony was volcanic. He saw in Cleopatra a mirror of his own grandeur. He the new Dionysus, she the new Isis. Together, the divine rulers of the Eastern world. Their alliance was both romantic and strategic. She needed him to restore Egypt's empire, and he obliged, returning Cyprus, parts of Lebanon and Syria, and the wealth of Jericho. He needed Egypt's grain and gold to fund his ambitions, and she provided them. They spent the winter in Alexandria in legendary extravagance, founding what ancient sources called the Society of the Inimitable Livers, an assembly of friends sworn to mutual pleasure and excess. They had 3 children together over the course of 11 years. By 34 BC, Antony had campaigned in Armenia and returned in triumph. But instead of parading his victory through Rome, as tradition demanded, he staged his celebration in Alexandria. He and Cleopatra sat together on golden thrones before the assembled city and distributed kingdoms to their children. Their son, Alexander Helios, received Armenia and the lands of Parthia, not yet conquered. Their daughter, Cleopatra Selene, received Cyrenaica and Libya. Young Ptolemy Philadelphus received Syria and Cilicia. And Cleopatra herself was proclaimed Queen of Kings, her son Caesarion named King of Kings beside her. In Rome, Octavian read the account and smiled. This was exactly what he needed. The donations of Alexandria handed Octavian his war. He accused Antony of giving away Roman territory to a foreign queen, of planning to move Rome's capital to Alexandria, of intending to make Caesarion, Caesar's biological son, not Octavian's adopted heir, the master of Rome. He seized Antony's will from the Temple of Vesta and read it aloud in the Senate, a shocking breach of Roman custom. The will confirmed Antony wished to be buried alongside Cleopatra in Egypt, not interred in the soil of Rome. Roman opinion, so carefully tended, turned like a tide going out. Octavian declared war not on Antony, which would have been a Roman civil war, but on Cleopatra, on the foreign queen, on the Eastern enchantress who had corrupted Rome's greatest general. It was a brilliant framing, cast the conflict as a war against alien influence, and the full weight of Roman patriotism became a weapon. By 31 BC, their forces had gathered at Actium on the western coast of Greece. Antony and Cleopatra had assembled perhaps 100,000 troops and 500 ships. Octavian matched them with a fleet built around speed, discipline, and the naval genius of Marcus Agrippa, arguably the finest strategist of the era. On the morning of September 2nd, 31 BC, the two fleets met in the waters off the promontory of Actium. The battle had been a stalemate for hours when Cleopatra's fleet, positioned at the rear, unfurled its sails and turned south, sailing away from the fight toward Egypt. Why she did this is one of history's most debated questions. Did she panic? Did she believe the battle was already lost and act to preserve Egypt's treasury and her own survival? Was it a prearranged plan to escape and regroup? Modern historians are divided. What is not disputed is what Antony did next. Seeing her departing fleet, he transferred to a smaller ship and followed. The great general who had commanded the loyalty of legions, the man his soldiers had loved and died for across a dozen campaigns, abandoned his men in the middle of a battle. His fleet, leaderless and bewildered, surrendered. The ancient world shifted in a single afternoon. They retreated to Alexandria for a final stand that never quite materialized. Antony's land army defected to Octavian. His navy changed sides. In August of 30 BC, Octavian marched on Alexandria virtually unopposed. Antony, receiving false reports that Cleopatra had committed suicide, stabbed himself in the stomach. He was dying when he was carried to the mausoleum where Cleopatra had barricaded herself with her treasury and her two devoted handmaids, Charmian and Iris. Too afraid to open the doors to Octavian's approaching forces, the women struggled to haul Antony's wounded body up through a high window on ropes. They pulled him inside. He died in her arms. Cleopatra was 39 years old, and the last calculation had run out. She met with Octavian, and what passed between them, no one can know with certainty. He meted her alive for his triumph parade through Rome. She had seen what Rome did to its conquered rulers. Vercingetorix the Gaul had been kept in a dungeon for 6 years before being strangled at his conqueror's triumph. Her own sister, Arsinoe, had been led through Rome in chains. This Cleopatra would not permit. Her entire life had been a masterclass in controlling her own narrative, in shaping how others perceived her power. Her death would be its final lesson. She would deny Octavian his ultimate prize, Cleopatra living and defeated as a symbol of his conquest. She would die a queen in her own kingdom in a moment of her own choosing. On August 10th, 30 BC, She was found dead in her mausoleum. Charmian and Iris lay dying beside her. The ancient sources, Plutarch, Dio Cassius, Suetonius, all report an asp, an Egyptian cobra smuggled in with a basket of figs, whose venom delivered a swift death. Modern toxicologists find this unlikely. A cobra's bite is painful, not peaceful, and two women dying simultaneously from one small snake strains credibility. Many historians now believe she used a concentrated poison, possibly administered by Pin. Whatever the method, it was chosen with the same care she gave to everything. Octavian reportedly expressed admiration. He gave her a royal funeral and buried her alongside Antony in the mausoleum she had built for herself. Then he had her 17-year-old son, Caesarion, the boy who carried the blood of both the Ptolemies and Julius Caesar, quietly killed. There could be no rival heir to Caesar left alive. Egypt fell to Rome on the day Cleopatra died. Octavian, who would soon take the name Augustus, made it his personal province, which he alone governed, never permitting the Senate to send a governor. The grain of Egypt fed Rome's million-person city. The wealth of Egypt funded the empire. The civilization that had endured for 3,000 years became, in one summer, Rome's treasure chest. And what of Cleopatra herself? Octavian had a problem. A woman as capable as Cleopatra could not be allowed to exist in Roman memory as an admirable figure, and so her reputation was carefully remade. In the poetry of Horace, she became a mad queen, drunk on power and wine. In the histories that survived, her brilliance was reduced to seduction, her political genius to sorcery. The woman who had spoken 9 languages, governed Egypt for 2 decades, and very nearly forged an Eastern empire capable of resisting Rome, she became a cautionary tale about the danger of ambition in women. It is one of history's great propaganda victories. Modern scholarship has spent decades peeling those layers back. Stacy Schiff, Adrian Goldsworthy, and a generation of historians have worked to restore the full complexity of this figure. A ruler who played the most dangerous game in the ancient world, against the most powerful men of her age, with intelligence and nerve and vision. She did not win, but the fact that she came as close as she did, a queen of a diminishing kingdom facing the full weight of Rome, is remarkable in ways that mythology cannot capture. When Octavian marched through Alexandria after her death, the city mourned. The great library, diminished by decades of war and neglect, would eventually be lost entirely. The ancient gods, Isis, Osiris, Horus, slowly gave way to other faiths. The long, brilliant story of Ptolemaic Egypt was over. But she does not feel over. Something in the story of Cleopatra refuses to settle quietly into the past. Perhaps it is the audacity, the queen smuggled in a carpet, the barge of gold at Tarsus, the locked mausoleum and its last private deaths. Perhaps it is the thought of what she might have built, given different weather at Actium, given a different afternoon. The last pharaoh of Egypt died as she had lived, on her own terms, at a moment of her own choosing, having burned brilliantly against a sky that was always trying to extinguish her.